Boom, shakalaka, we're back. It's 2021. Happy New Year, everybody. 2020 is behind us. I hope it bangs its arse painfully on the door on the way out, because that's the year we all want to put behind us. But a happy belated New Year to all of you for our first Live with Littlewood of 2021. It is Wednesday, January the 20th. On January the 20th in 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in for an unprecedented and never to be repeated fourth term as president. In 1981, Ronnie Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th president. And in 2009, Barack Obama became the 44th president of the USA and its first African-American president. And today, here in 2021, Joe Biden has just become the oldest person ever to be sworn in into the world's most powerful position. I nearly misread that and said Joe Biden is the oldest person in the world, but I don't think that's quite true, actually. But he is now the 46th president of the United States of America, and we're going to be discussing where he might take us. So welcome to this show with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General at the Institute of Economic Affairs. In addition to discussing Joe Biden, stars and strife, we're calling it. Can he bring harmony back to the disunited USA, or do the battle scars just run too deeply? And I'm interested in what his program's going to do. What's the Biden administration actually going to do? We've got some pretty eye-watering numbers about some of his economic policies. What will the implications be for the United States of America, us in the UK, and the rest of the world? Also on tonight's show, vaccine vacillation. Is the government's vaccine rollout hitting a few bumps in the road? The UK's been doing pretty well overall compared to other countries, but perhaps we haven't really got our foot to the floor on it. Reports are suggesting ministers are concerned about a drop in supply of the Pfizer vaccine. If that's the case, when can 24/7 inoculation start? How could the programme be accelerated? We'll be asking our stellar lineup of guests to give us their answers to that. And in the UK and elsewhere, should regions with efficient vaccination rollouts be held back by areas which have been slower and therefore getting transfers of supplies? Is there a postcode lottery? And if there is, should we care? Also tonight, universal approval. Government ministers are said to be at odds with each other over whether the current £20 uplift in universal credit should be extended. At the same time, some MPs and the Labour benches want to see the temporary rise made permanent at the estimated cost of £6 billion a year. As Ronald Reagan once said, there is nothing so permanent in life as a temporary government programme. Can the UK economy afford to keep spending at this sort of level? And Brexit, the story so far. Remember that one? There were dire warnings that Brexit would bring customs chaos, empty supermarket shelves, and much more. But all things considered, it seems to have gone pretty smoothly. So will Boris Johnson and his government now set about remodelling the UK as a less regulated, lower tax, liberalised Singapore of Europe, at least in economic terms? Or really is this government simply one of coronavirus-inspired tax and spend? That's all to come later on in the show over the next 100 minutes or so. And I'm delighted once again to be joined by a fantastic array of economists, journalists, commentators, and think tankers. Coming up later on in the show, we'll be joined by Matt Kilcoyne, the Deputy Director of the Adam Smith Institute, the science editor at the Times newspaper, my first cousin, Tom Whipple, the Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, our friends just around the corner, John O'Connell, Christian Calgie, the Senior Reporter at the Guido Fawkes website, Ali Renison, Head of EU and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors, and from the home team, our very own IEA Head of Lifestyle Economics and Scourge of the Nanny State, Christopher Snowdon. They will all be with us later. But first up, I'm delighted to be able to welcome a new guest to the show and a returning guest to Live with Littlewood. Calvin Robinson is a political advisor and commentator, and he writes regular columns in The Telegraph, The Daily Mail, among others. He's a former assistant principal and is currently consulting for the Department of Education. He's also a senior fellow at Policy Exchange, the think tank. Again, just round the corner from us. Calvin, great to have you with us. How are you? Good evening.
An absolute pleasure, Mark. Thanks for the invitation. I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good. We are bestowing a great honour on you, Calvin, because it turns out you are actually the 100th different guest on Live with Littlewood. We clock up to number 100.
Where's the champagne?
Yeah, exactly. We'll send you champagne as soon as we're able to do so. And we're also rejoined, regular on the show. This is actually your 100th appearance on the show, I think, Terry. Terry Kibbe, co-founder and chief executive officer of Free the People, an educational organisation which uses pop culture and video storytelling to, quote, turn on the liberty curious. Hi, Terry. Good evening from where I am. Good afternoon where you're at.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me back. I'm reporting here from inside the military zone around the U.S. Capitol for the inauguration today.
Well, let's start with that. How's it gone? You were telling me, Terry, just before we came on air, you're in the green zone, but the meaning of being in the green zone is it's nearly as red as the red zone, but there are armed police everywhere. Joe Biden, of course, now is president, but from what I can tell so far, everything's passed off relatively peacefully, right? Even if there's a very, very high security presence.
Right, it is peaceful, but I went out for a walk this morning and passed hundreds of fully armed military personnel at just about every corner. I saw one demonstrator. It was a lone woman doing an anti-abortion protest. There was one guy yelling at her to shut up, and there was about 50 journalists recording all of this. So I think that the journalists and police are definitely outnumbering anyone that's here to protest from either side.
Okay. And Calvin, watching it from this side of the pond, what are we to make of Joe Biden as president? Are we kind of back to boring? And is that a good thing? Is Joe Biden a return to normal? I mean, he's a kind of moderate-ish, isn't he? Middle of the road Democrat. Hasn't 2016 to 2020 been a bit too exciting, both in the UK and the US? And in 2021, we're returning to something normal. What do you basically make of the new president, Calvin?
I wish it was a return to something normal. I don't think it is at all. I'm very worried about what this means. He's been courting the wokeists for a long time now, and he's not really standing up to China either. So it could mean terrible things for the whole country. When I look at the executive order that President Trump released, the one about not discriminating against sexuality or race, the one that's known as the CRT executive order, it was a fantastic piece of legislation, some of the best work I've seen in a long time. And Biden's been talking about removing that. So that, to me, sets a precedent in that he's not looking to solve these issues of racial inequalities or sexual discrimination. He's actually looking to appease the woke masses and look like one of the good guys rather than actually doing good work. And all the stuff that's coming around about his family and his links to China, I'm not going to go into them, but I think it's very disturbing, and I hope that the press really nail him for this. So far, I haven't seen that. I've seen, the press, the mainstream media at least, are talking to Kamala and Joe about what trainers they wear, for example, and giving them a real easy ride in comparison to what Trump's had for the last 4 years.
And Terry, what's your take on it? Of course, President Biden's party hasn't just won back the Oval Office. The special elections in Georgia mean there's a narrow Democrat majority in the Senate, and they've kept control of the House of Representatives. So it's kind of Democrat clean sweep in the two houses and the White House. What do you basically make of Joe Biden? Are you with Calvin, or is it too early to stay? Come on, he's only been president for 70 minutes.
Well, I listened to his inaugural speech, and it was like watching a Seinfeld episode. It was really about nothing. He said all of the right words that he would feel that he needs to say about bringing the country back to unity, and we all need to get along. And he really didn't, but he didn't say anything. I do think that he is of the more moderate wing of the party. His cabinet is made up a lot of people from Obama's administration, which, given today's situation, is definitely considered moderate. But he's being pushed. Kamala Harris is certainly not of the moderate wing. Nancy Pelosi barely held on to her speakership, again, being forced farther to the left. It remains to be seen. And yes, the Democrats have control of the House and Senate, but it's such a slim majority that I don't think that it's going to be as easy for them to pass things as they might hope. Of course, the last time that this happened, there was a push to try to get someone to defect from either party to bring on a true majority in the Senate. And I think we'll see that happening here. I think Joe Manchin from West Virginia could possibly become a Republican. He's probably more Republican than a lot of the people currently in the party. But then you also have Lisa Murkowski from Alaska talking about how she would join the Democratic Party. I don't think it's going to be as easy, but I think I'm worried. I do think that he's going to do a lot of bad things for the country. He's going to try to reverse just about everything that Trump did through executive order. The only thing that he's going to embrace that Trump did do was the ridiculous overusage of executive order. I think he's just going to double down, and we're going to see so much of that in just today alone, but then again within the next 100 days.
That's really interesting, Terry. So do you think there's a danger that some of the constitutional norms are breaking down? I mean, I've also seen it suggested that they, I don't know how realistic this is or how serious it is, that they might extend the size of the Supreme Court. So horrified are they that there's a Conservative majority on the Supreme Court? Have normal protocols now been abandoned by both sides of the aisle? Of course, Donald Trump wasn't at the inauguration. Somewhere it was said to me he was only the fourth person not to be at the inauguration as his successor. But as more than 4 American presidents have been assassinated, I find that rather hard to believe. But he wasn't there. Okay, I mean, that's just him throwing his toys out of the pram. But my wider question, Terry, was, are established sort of cultural constitutional norms in danger of breaking down because the two sides are so polarized?
Yes, I do think so. I mean, the use of executive order has been overused. I think Bush 41 was the first one to really start using that power to get things through that he couldn't get through Congress. And every president since then has just ramped it up. Yes, there's a lot of talk about stacking the Supreme Court and adding more members. I mean, number 9 was, that number is not set in stone. It could be 5, it could be 12, it could be whatever they want. But I think that there'll be a huge pushback against trying to do that. I think that they're going to try to do as much as they can. But again, because the government is so close, I think it'll be difficult for them to do it. Not to say that they won't try.
Calvin, let me come back to you. You mentioned your extreme unease about Joe Biden's approach to sort of woken identity and race issues. Do you think this could now be the big dividing line in American politics, perhaps in Western politics, that we're seeing a realignment? I mean, it used to be around whether you sort of leaning to free market liberal or leaning towards social democrat economically. Are we seeing politics in the States and perhaps across the Western world now just being redefined in different ways, that maybe Trump wasn't a total anomaly? Maybe this is the way that the traditional parties and movements that we've got used to over the past 20, 30, 40 years are morphing into something quite different. What do you think the big dividing lines, Calvin, are going to be in the States?
Absolutely, that is completely spot on. If you just look at the inauguration speech, as bland as it was, he did put in there as often as he could the issue of race. And this is what the left are really perpetuating at the moment, that the West in general, not just America or Britain, but the West in general is systemically racist. And I don't necessarily think that's true. Yes, there are elements of racism in our society that we need to stamp out, but the idea that everything is institutionally racist and racism is everywhere is a divisive, toxic ideology that the left are really pushing because they've given up on class. And the left used to be all about class and social mobility and, fighting for workers' rights and unions and all of that. And they've left that behind because they are now the elite. The left are the elite, they are the establishment, so they can't fight that battle. So that's, I think, why they've shifted to race. And it's the same in the US as it is here, in that it's no longer a case of how was someone racist to you in this situation. It's it's now a case of where was the racism in this situation, not was this racism. Everything is racist, everyone is racist, and that's going to split people up because most people aren't racist, and most people just want to go about their normal lives without being accused of being a bad guy just for happening to be white or happening to live in America, or all these privileges that we talk about these days. The more the left pushes this, the more it's going to split people up.
Very, very interesting that those might be the new dividing lines, and we're seeing elements of that too in the UK debate. So perhaps I'm being a bit 1980s to really give a damn about economic policy, right? But I want to have a look at economic policy and what Biden is intending to do in the early stages of his presidency. And some of it is a little eye-watering. I mean, some of it might be impressive, but I'd be interested to hear Calvin and Terry's views. He set a goal of 100 million COVID vaccinations in his first 100 days in office. Don't know how feasible that is. He's promising an extra $1.9 trillion in additional COVID relief on top of the $3 trillion already given away or spent. If this stimulus package, if this stimulus budget, rather than just being a policy, was actually a country, it would, in dollar terms, be the 10th largest country in the world. That's the $1.9 trillion. If you combine it with the previous $3 trillion that's already been spent, and you were to consider the amount of money not as a government program, but as an economy, then it would be the third largest economy in the world. This is just what the American government is spending on coronavirus relief. It would be marginally greater in size than the total economy of Japan. His overall plan includes an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour, a move which could kill as many as 3.7 million jobs, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which is a non-partisan federal agency. My favorite campaigning T-shirt of all time was one that was, I think it was designed by a campaign group in Seattle, which had emblazoned upon it, robots in favor of the minimum wage, in the belief that the minimum wage going up would lead to faster automation. Terry, what are we to make, or how fiscally stimulated are you feeling by your new president, Terry?
Not very. I mean, you mentioned the 3.7 million jobs that would be lost if he implements the $15 minimum wage. I think it would even be more than that. He talks from both sides of his mouth, right? On one hand, he talks about wanting to get the economy back and get past COVID, open up businesses. But if you're going to have these companies and small businesses that are barely holding on right now as a result of all of the government lockdowns, and then you implement a $15 minimum wage, I see more businesses going out of just going out of business. And I think that 3.7 million lost jobs is a gross estimate of the damage that it would cause. They keep trying to spend.
Is back, right? Big spending's back, Terry. I mean, it wasn't as if you might say Donald Trump did a bit on tax cuts and deregulation, but big spending is very much the new norm, isn't it, on both sides of the pond?
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, it wasn't. Didn't we used to say it was always about it was guns or butter, right? The left wanted social programs and the right wanted military and defense spending, and so they would compromise. And so it was either spending on guns or spending on butter. And now, unfortunately, we spend on both guns and butter, and there is no such thing. No one has been advocating for smaller government and smaller spending. Maybe the Republicans will find their backbone again and start at least talking the talk, but we'll see.
Calvin, is your view, you were agreeing with my broad analysis that it's going to be matters of identity and culture wars and race and the like that could define political discourse. But do you think this colossal spending package from the Democrats will lead to the Republicans opposing it, that we might have some divide, which is free market, relatively lower state people against these, endless, huge government programs? Or has that particular boat long left port, and it's just a few of us in the IEA who are screaming blue murder about it and will be proven tragically right in years to come?
I would like to think that you are right, but I agree with Terry that big government is the thing of the moment, isn't it? And I think economics is dead for now, to be honest with you. We seem to have found the magic money tree that we spent years campaigning against, both sides of the pond. The fact that we're just spending money on COVID left, right, and centre wherever we see fit without thinking about how we're going to recover that. You know, all these years in the UK, all these years of austerity are kind of gone out the window now, aren't they? This idea of upping the minimum wage in America is going to leave so many people jobless. How people can't get that by now, after all the years of campaigning from people like yourselves, is just beyond me, to be honest with you. We need heavier lobbying from free marketeers in the States and in the UK. I don't understand how we're doing the same thing over here. We've got Rishi Sunak talking about implementing socialist tax policies. It's not okay after all these years of a conservative government.
Terry, is the magic money tree believed to be alive and well in the USA? I mean, governments have been spending really across the Western world. The taps have been running. I think it's, you have to go all the way back to 2001 before the UK actually had a balanced budget. We seem to have got into the cycle of, in the good times, we slightly overspend, and in the bad times, we horrifically overspend. Same in the States?
Yes, I think that the federal government's just going to keep printing money. We're going to see inflation. They'll try to raise taxes as much as they can. It was interesting. The governor of Illinois just recently said that he was going to take some of the federal stimulus money that was supposed to be going out to small businesses in the state and keep it for himself as a way to balance the state budget and to make up for some of the deficits. So we'll see some interesting things happening at the state level as well as the federal government.
Okay. I mentioned Joe Biden on his pledged 100 million vaccinations within 100 days. We'll return to that shortly. Calvin and Terry stay with us, but I want to bring two other guests to the show as we consider how the vaccine rollout is going in the UK and across the world as a whole. The UK does seem to be leading the pack, at least for the moment. But this could be a bit like the England football team, flattered to deceive, only make it to the quarterfinals and then fall flat on our face as somebody overtakes us. But is this programme now hitting a bit of a bump in the road? As I mentioned, the number of vaccinations seems to be falling a little. There's a concern about the Pfizer vaccination actually being able to be supplied as rapidly as we have hoped. There's an argument about which regions should receive the vaccination first, whether we should be targeting those regions that haven't vaccinated particularly efficiently, give them more support and the rest of it. How are we doing and how can we do better? Delighted to be welcomed by Matt Kilcoyne of the Adam Smith Institute for his thoughts, and a warm welcome back to Tom Whipple, my cousin and the science editor of The Times. Good evening to you, Tom. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Tom, how are we doing? I mean, you and I have discussed the appropriate public policy response to this coronavirus. I probably would have wanted to relax some of the restrictions a lot even before the vaccination process was rolling out. But is the end now in sight? Can we kind of almost on a trajectory see a day when we're finally through this and we can put this miserable bloody period behind us, Tom?
I think sort of. It's not quite the panacea that I think, we'd have all predicted it would be back in April. Quite clearly, there's a heck of a lot of logistics that needs to be done. These things aren't coming through as fast as we'd have thought. And there are all these nuances about what a single dose actually means. And then there's a massive curveball in South Africa that might just bugger things up entirely for us. So with those duly pessimistic caveats, and this is a year for duly pessimistic caveats, I would say, yes, this is the only way we're getting out of it. So thank God we've got it, and we appear to be doing better than everyone else in Europe.
And do you have, I was speaking to some think tank colleagues earlier this week, Tom, about, I would defer to the medical experts and the administrators of the process, but could we now build a sort of trajectory? We're vaccinating at this rate a day. We know that the virus is extremely ageist. And so once we've got the most vulnerable demographic secured, we've solved a very big part of the problem. Can we now sort of do on a line graph? It looks like March the 27th will have, it will all be great and we can go back to normal. or are there still too many variables to be able to make those sort of predictions?
I mean, there are a heck of a lot of variables. The COVID Actuaries Research Group, who've been absolutely brilliant, has tried to do this. And it's done it with loads of assumptions, which is all you can do at the moment. And they've estimated if we hit our sort of 15 million target, then by the beginning of March, we'll probably see deaths 90% lower. That's 90% lower than they would have been without it. I mean, we don't know what the third wave's doing, so you know, lockdown could have brought them down loads as well. But hospitalizations in ICU will not have been as significantly affected by then, because people in ICU are a bit younger. I mean, bluntly, they're the people you think are actually going to benefit from being in ICU, so they're less likely to be amongst that first load. They're likely to be people who are a little bit younger. So they said probably a third down on ICU by then, and then spring hits. But yeah, if we hit that, then that's great. But it is a big if. At the moment, it's slightly weird. We're seeing, you said vaccine numbers have been down, they've been up. We now look like we're back on sort of the trajectory to hit our 15th of March or 15 million target by the middle of March, also by the middle of February. But each day is a surprise. The government is not releasing any sense of they're releasing this one figure, which is how many people have been vaccinated. But we whether national security or commercial sensitivities, whether it's been in the contracts with Pfizer that they can't release how they're getting them, we just don't know. We've been asking the question for the past 4 months. How many doses in country, on way to country, being bottled? We just don't have it.
Matt, let me bring you in. The Adam Smith Institute released a paper recently, great paper, we'll link to it in the chat, called Worth a Shot, Accelerating COVID-19 Vaccinations. And you came up with a whole range of ideas, liberalizing ideas, in which we could roll this out at a far, far greater speed, really put our foot to the floor. What were some of those ideas, and have the government taken any of them up, or is this going to be a slow stumble to the finish line?
So it was really important that the government ramp up vaccinations, because the slow speed with which it started to do so was a real risk, both to loss of life and also more generally to the economy. We were estimating about 5 billion direct and 6 billion indirect of lost economic activity every single week that we don't have the economy open, and also, of course, the thousands of lives that we're seeing per day lost to the virus itself in the second wave. And we don't know, of course, as Tom says, about the wave and so on. The government's slow rate of vaccination, when on the sort of 4th of January, when we released the report, in order to get vaccinated all of the vulnerable group, that sort of phase 1 vulnerable group, at the rate at which they were doing it, we were looking at December 2023 before it was all done, which was a really, really quite poor effort. So we suggested 22 different ways in which the government could come up with liberalizing the flow of vaccine and also therefore getting it into people's arms. Now, the government has improved the rate of vaccination. In fact, they took up 11 of our 22 proposals, including the use of the armed forces, which we're seeing very much advertised up in Scotland, the British Army up there, rolling out 80 different vaccination centres, the commissioning of pharmacies, the use of public venues, trialling of 24/7 vaccination services, which was one that the public were clamouring for, but the government said they weren't clamouring for, and the reason that they said they weren't clamouring was because they'd got some management consultants in at a very expensive price tag to tell them that actually the public didn't want it. Well, that was complete nonsense. They've managed to use, and in fact, they've got 50,000 volunteers or 58,000 volunteers via Jabs Army, thanks to the campaign from The Sun, another part of News UK organizations, but increasing marketing, payments to GPs, bonuses based on how quickly you can get them in, all that kind of stuff has been gone in, and we're very grateful that both the government took up these ideas and that they've done them. Now, we've also come up since then with another 8 different proposals that the government should take in, and we've been briefing these out over the past week. But one of the major ones that we really want them to do in order to get so to the point where we're able to reopen the whole of the economy this summer or earlier, preferably once all of the vulnerable groups are done. And we think that actually if you increase the rate to the level that Israel has seen, you could do that by Easter, maybe a little bit after that. But one of the major ones that you have to do, and we really should be focusing on right now, is making sure that vaccination centers are safe places for people to be getting vaccines. We saw a lot of the time that the vaccination centers were places without ventilation, places that were quite small. And again, that's sort of like that lack of basic understanding that this is an aerosol transmitted virus, and that therefore airflow, making sure that there's clean airflow, that all people won't sit in stuffy rooms, is a massive, massive one that they need to get on top of, and they still haven't yet got on top of.
Calvin, let me come back to you. What's your audit of how well the UK is doing? If you just look at it in sort of bar graph terms, we're not necessarily leading the world, but we're in the Champions League spaces, right? We're doing better than Europe, at least at this stage. Do you think the government's got it right? Or going back to some of your criticisms of the woke, is there red tape that's standing in the way? I mean, we've had dozens of medics have complained that they've been asked for proof that they're trained in areas before they can administer the vaccine, such as preventing radicalization, conflict resolution, equality, diversity and human rights, fire safety and safeguarding children, even though no children are being vaccinated. I mean, those are at the more sort of preposterous end. Retired doctors and nurses are having to spend hours on relearning things like equality and human rights. I mean, how much should we be worried whether the person injecting the jab into a patient's arm is sufficiently attuned to working out whether that patient could become an Islamic terrorist? I mean, do you think that is a sensible health and safety protocol, or just gamming up the process? Could we do better, Calvin?
Well, you never know, Mark. No, I think we should celebrate our successes. This government, I've criticised them heavily. They've made a lot of mistakes throughout this COVID time, but in getting the vaccine out, they've done really well. However, this is a criticism on the NHS, this diversity training tick box that you need in order to administer the vaccine. Of course, that needs to go. The government has made it very clear that diversity training does not work and should not be promoted. Therefore, a public institution should not be having it as a criteria. But regardless of that, I think there are lots of things we could be doing. I've considered why we live in a parochial system in this country. We have parishes set up all across the country. Why are we not using the parish system to get vaccines out? Why are we not devolving it down to local councils, which have polling centres that they can set up at the click of a finger? Maybe some of the things that Matt talked about with ventilation are coming into it, I don't know. But I think there is a lot more we can be doing and could be doing, but we should still celebrate our success because we've done really well. We've got a lot of people vaccinated, much more so than America and lots of other countries.
Terry, your former president suggested that injecting yourself with Dettol might be a sensible way of avoiding getting conflicted by the COVID-19. Your current president is promising 100 million vaccines in 100 days. Are both of these men fantasists?
Yes. So as of 2 days ago, there were 31 million vaccines available in the US, and only 19 million had actually been given out. So there's 11 million that are sitting there that haven't been used yet. The premise that once a new president is in, somehow the supply system is going to magically appear and there's going to be this many more vaccines available for people, and that the distribution of it will occur much more efficiently is pure fantasy. I was just reading an article that said that if only the federal government develops a database and a system for the entire country to give out these vaccines, everything will happen, at a blink of an eye. Well, it will take the federal government at least 2 years to do a database to enable this. So it's just pure fiction that one person can make this happen. I agree with Calvin. I mean, things need to be done at the local level as possible. And once the federal government gets involved, it's just going to slow things up. There may be an increase in the vaccination rate, but that's just because of production. It won't have anything to do with the new president.
Tom, let me come back to you because I know we've only got you for another 10 minutes or so, Tom. Again, in helping us navigate the science and my yearning for a number or a percentage, which will just be the end, right? What's happened to herd immunity? It obviously hasn't been pursued as a strategy, but we might get there by accident, right? I think I was reading earlier, 1 in 8 people in Britain are thought to have had COVID already. So that's 12% plus of the population. We've now vaccinated, another 4 or 5 million. Once we get to this assumed 60%, which I've no doubt you're going to tell me I shouldn't be putting such religious faith in. I mean, then it's all done, isn't it? I mean, I appreciate every year we'll have to have this, like flu jabs, but give me some sort of number of hope at which this bloody thing's over.
Well, so the 60% figure, unfortunately, probably needs to be a bit higher now because we've got the new transmissible strain. Yeah, you can add on that 1 in 8 that are probably basically immune. There's probably a bit higher as well. That's 1 in 8 people who have detectable antibodies, but the number of people infected is probably 50% bigger than that, and probably some of those also have some immunity. We're quite clearly seeing that people can be reinfected, which means that this herd immunity is slightly a sort of shifting thing. But your reinfections aren't going to be so severe, so that's a good thing. I think probably we're going to end up with about 70% being the figure. And I don't know. Look, I've been far too.
But am I right, Tom, that would then be total success? I mean, I've been arguing we could liberalise already, right? But I mean, surely to God, when we've vaccinated 50% of the population and everybody over the age of 65, we're not going to wait until every 19-year-old is vaccinated before we open pubs again, are we?
No, I think that'll probably be total success in terms of opening, but it won't be the end of the nightmare. If you look at what's going on in Manaus in Brazil, it's deeply depressing. This is the city in Brazil that we thought was the closest or most plausible any place had reached something approaching herd immunity, and now they're just having an absolutely horrific time, probably because of reinfections from this new strain. So, I mean, realistically, we have to look at solving this in the world. Even if you just don't give a toss about anyone in any other country, it turns out
you should do for your own self-interest, you're saying.
Yeah, it's just completely enlightened self-interest. You can't have this thing infecting loads of people.
And Tom, where should we be looking to in the world? Calvin was saying, UK government deserves a bit of a slap on the back, at least in its sort of relatively performance. But Israel, wow. I mean, that's the model to follow, isn't it? They've aced it, haven't they?
The problem is no one knows. I mean, I'm trying to get an interview with the head of their vaccine program at the moment because I want to understand what's gone on. No one in the world seems to be as yet being transparent enough to find out why. Why has Israel been so amazing? It's not because it's a small country. It's found a way to proportionately get far more doses in the country and into people's arms. And everything is opaque at the moment. I mean, Calvin, you guys are having the chat about, whether or not people should fill in diversity forms, and there's a perfectly reasonable argument that they shouldn't do that. But I suspect it doesn't matter. That's not the bottleneck in the system. I'm sure we can employ these vaccinators doing all manner of bureaucracy, and that's fine, because that's not the reason why we're not putting these doses in faster.
Matt, why is Israel so amazing?
So Israel has at least from the chats that I've been having, it has a head start, firstly, because it promised to get, so long as it got supply, it promised to then give data across for it. So it was prioritized for supply. Secondly, it has some of the factories. Thirdly, it has some of the key bits for that. Thirdly, it has the IDF, and therefore was able to call up on a massive conscription basis a large number of people who were medically trained very quickly, and then immediately distribute out. Logistics being one of the defense force of Israel's key strengths, and that's not really a surprise. I mean, a lot of the sort of management consultancy non-waste stuff doesn't sound like it isn't very sexy, but is quite important in terms of breaking down doses, making sure that pallets weren't wasted, which is what we've seen a real problem with in the United States. But Tom, I'm sure, will get a better understanding from it when he eventually has that chat. But at least from the sort of headlines, that sort of seems what's happened. Lack of waste is very important. I think as well, Kibbe really hanged his entire reputation on this. Whereas, although Boris, has said that it's really important to get it out, what he's doing right now, which is very uncharacteristic for Boris, is under-promising to try and over-deliver. And actually, it's the opposite effect of what we wanted. And it's the opposite of what happened with testing in April last year, when Boris finally set a ridiculously ambitious target which they then met and then met again the next month. Boris needs to be setting a huge target and then also being extremely upfront and transparent with the data that's coming out about where things are going wrong, where the bottleneck is, which the NHS and also Public Health England and Wales and so on are not very good at. They don't have the incentive structures usually for it. And so you're not getting that feed through of expertise from across industry, which you would really want in the sort of war effort that we are going through, or we should be going for in terms of vaccination. Because there's all sorts of things where it might be going slightly wrong, and you just aren't hearing someone going, oh, I usually deal with that with, supplies of oranges into the UK, or supply of other glassware into the UK or whatever, which sounds ridiculous, but there's all sorts of expertise that you can't plan for, that you need to be able to be brought in at short notice. And I'm just not sure that the government has managed to get rid of its invented here approach well enough yet to ramp up properly.
Terry, you sounded a sceptical note about the ability of the federal government or central governments to roll things out. Is there any pattern in America that we could learn from? I don't know, has South Dakota done this really well and Missouri done it absolutely appallingly? Any lessons to learn? I mean, if you're supposed to have these 50 states that are all federal and diverse and can pursue their own destiny, surely there's some lessons we can learn from whoever's top of the pile, isn't there? Or has everybody failed?
There's definitely been government failures across the board, but you mentioned South Dakota. I mean, Kristi Noem has done a great job. She hasn't locked down the state. Their numbers have been fairly good. Their economy isn't doing as poorly as many are. Look at New York and California as just abysmal failures. Federalism works in the US. You can look at the various states that have just, Republican governors. Florida, for example, their numbers have been really good, and the state is fairly open. And given the fact that Florida is known as heaven's waiting room, since most people move to Florida, the fact that their rates are low shows that locking down economies and businesses is not the path forward.
Calvin, let me come back to you. You were saying that we should localise an awful lot more, and I mean that music to the ears of IEA people, that sort of central planning and central schemes rolled out in a room in Whitehall for various different areas is probably not the way to get the maximum efficiency. We're already seeing here there are vastly different numbers, right? The Midlands seems to be vaccinating people very quickly, London a little bit less so, and that's then leading to arguments about the postcode lottery, right? I mean, that it's a sort of random feature. And how do we manage to devolve power to whatever the appropriate level is? You were suggesting parishes, and overcome this idea that overcome this complaint that there's a postcode lottery, because clearly if you do devolve power, and in some ways you have to, at least administratively, there will be different outcomes in different places, right? That's the point of decentralization. But then everybody complains if they're not top of the list. So how do we localize this and get off this, I think, peculiarly British hook of people saying it's a postcode lottery, it's outrageous that things in Leicester are different to things in Leinster?
I think we just have to get over that, because the bottleneck is the government. And listening to what Matt was saying, he was spot on in that we know that governments are not very good at running things, which is why we outsource, which is why we privatize. And if we devolve things down to a local level, so that local councils or local parishes or whatever can source their own infrastructure to get this done, or either we have that approach, or we get the British Army in. And I know the British Army are fantastic, one of the best in the world. Someone mentioned that the IDF were doing a great job in Israel. We could do the same over here. We're not. My friends in the army are telling me that they've all been stood down for now until I don't know what they're waiting on. But we could be doing it if we want to do it the authoritarian government approach, big government approach. That's the way to do it, or get it down to a local level. At the moment, we're a mishmash in between that just doesn't work and doesn't function as well as it could, and we know that. All the think tanks know that. I just want the government to kind of wake up to that and do something about it.
Tom, I know you need to leave us in just a minute or two, so I'll come back to you for another thought. I'm pressing you in the same way that journalists are pressing the Prime Minister on what the end date is. Do you have in your mind, I mean, I know it will be staging posts rather than a final victory, but do you have in your mind, early April, mid-May, things should largely be back to normal, at least in terms of the way healthy people who can go and live their lives? I'm not suggesting that there won't be anybody in hospital. That's a problem we've got to deal with. But in terms of normal day-to-day life returning to what it was in February 2020, give me a date.
I think it's going to be, I mean, as I say, it's impossible because there's going to be staging posts. I think it's highly likely, and I wouldn't have said this a month ago, I think it's highly likely we're not going to be going on foreign holidays this summer. I think the thing that's going to make it feel actually genuinely, and this is a positive note, the thing that will make it feel genuinely positive is it's going to be a ratchet. I don't think we're going to be in a situation where we open and then close, where restaurants suddenly discover they've got loads of stock that they've got to chuck away. But I also think there's going to be caution, because really this has always been about ICU beds, and we're running really close now to full, and the modelling suggests that it's going to take a long time for that to change, even with vaccines. It's not going to be a normal summer, but it's going to feel like it.
Don't know why you say people won't be able to get away for the summer. I'm broadcasting from Tenerife at the moment. I'm not coming back until the end of bloody February. I've done the numbers. I reckon my vaccine's ready on February the 27th. I'm coming back on February the 26th. You just need to be a bit more entrepreneurial about this. I haven't broken any laws, got out before lockdown happened. It's just good planning and individual.
Well, you also don't have 3 kids, but yes, I'm very envious.
Tom, always lovely to have you. I know you need to leave us now. It's 6:45, but thanks so much. Lovely to see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Let me get a few thoughts from the rest of the panel. Matt, what's your view of these regional discrepancies that we're seeing in the UK? And then there's a suggestion, which might be the worst of all worlds, that we'll kind of divert even more supplies of the virus to the least efficient areas. You know, or something's going horribly wrong in Bognor Regis, send them whole quantities of supply. If your overall aim is to roll out the vaccine as fast as possible, you almost want to give more vaccines to the most efficient areas, right? You just want to get this number of, you know, however many millions we've got to vaccinate over the line as quickly as you bloody well can. Not a sort of welfarist view that we need to send crates and crates to the top of Mount Snowdon because there are 3 people who live there and nobody's been vaccinated yet. What do you make of the approach so far and the argument around it?
I love your. I in my head for a second, I thought you were talking about efficient sort of industries, and I thought that was really sort of mean way to talk about teachers. But in terms of in terms of sort of like it actually is quite an important point, because right now the government is coming under quite sustained lobbying from various sectors and membership organisations to prioritise sector specifics, including teachers. But actually, the government's response to vaccinate based on vulnerability or likelihood of vulnerability is still completely correct. The government must not succumb to concentrated interest groups lobbying to prioritise their preferred people. And obviously, in terms of who has government's ear and also who has sort of continuing and all long-lasting links to government, it's nearly always the public sector because they are employed by the public sector. So so I don't think we should succumb to that, but I think we should continue with the path we're doing. In terms of getting pieces up to speed, I'm actually relatively quite happy with Matt Hancock's response on that so far, which has been, if you are steaming ahead, then you can carry on. In fact, you can go further down your list. You can go to the over 70s, under 65s, and so on. The last thing the government should do, and has happened in other parts of the US and so on, has been to say slow down to ensure that other pieces can catch up. And Wales, of course, the Welsh First Minister, Mark Drakeford, he's having a torrid week, saying that actually he's got to slow down vaccinations in order to make sure that they eke out all of the use of the supply. It's kind of like saying, I can't sell you the last pair of Nikes in the shop because then I'll have sold the last pair of Nikes. I won't have any more to sell you. It's like, no.
I thought one of his arguments was he didn't want the people carrying out the vaccinations to be idle. So
he didn't want them to be
NH
bored.
staff being bored was the top priority for the Welsh government, rather than actually vaccinating Welsh citizens. Bloody madness.
True,
yeah.
and I think actually that did stun Wales. It stunned the rest of the country as well, to be fair. But fundamentally, it's about getting as many jabs in as many arms as humanly possible. As Tom sort of insinuated, I think the one thing the government could do, if they really wanted to sort of speed things up, is to say, if you have had a positive coronavirus test in the past month or two or 3 months, you are likely to have had antibodies. If you are then offered a vaccine, like on a moral level, you should probably say no, because then the next person can go ahead who hasn't had it, and that would speed things up. I think as well, like a good level of on an online, and we said like let's do bookings, and maybe we should use some of the call center workers that aren't employed right now or furloughed to also start ringing round people of certain ages, so that we're getting quicker responses. Because one of the bottlenecks that we didn't mention but is real is the fact that Royal Mail are sending out letters, but Royal Mail are having real problems getting their staff working at the moment. And so they aren't getting the letters to people of a certain age. Right. And so they aren't then making appointments. And that's been a big of an issue. And that's something that could be solved relatively quickly. And actually, if you then ring them, then they can start to do that.
Terry and Calvin, I'll come for your final thoughts before I let you go. And I didn't ask Tom this. I was so keen to make sure that I didn't make him late for his next appointment. I didn't give him the opportunity to give his optimism number. But then he's a scientist. What would he know? We only want to hear optimism numbers from political commentators and social scientists, not real scientists. So Calvin, just so you're aware, I ask all of our guests to give me their optimism rating between 0 and 10. Must be an integer, a single integer. I don't like people saying 6.4, or I don't like people saying 5 or 6. And the question is, how optimistic are you between 0 and 10 on how free and prosperous the UK will be in 2 to 3 years' time? So you can think about that, Kelvin, while I come to Terry. How optimistic are you feeling, Terry? And I'd also like to ask you, before you give us our number, do you think libertarians, free marketeers, classical liberals, do you think when the lessons from this whole coronavirus pandemic and the way lockdown was dealt with are drawn, and there'll be public inquiries, but there'll also be loads of private inquiries. It will be a matter for considerable public debate. Should we be hopeful about that as well? Do you think big government will have been seen to have failed and little platoons will have been seen to be successful? Or is the age of big government that we were talking about at the outset now going to be permanently with us? Terry, your thoughts on that and your number?
Well, I mean, as a libertarian, I think that it's clear that big government has failed. And we, the royal we, those of us on the call that believe in limited government, I mean, we do need to step up. As they say, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So we have tremendous opportunities here to point out all of the massive failures that the government has done. And the challenge, of course, is getting the word out and using social media and things like that to bypass mainstream media that likes to talk about how if only we have like a better president, like the world will be a better place. If only government was bigger, we can take better care of you. We just have to do all that we can to fight against that horrible, horrible narrative. I think we have a great opportunity. We just have to be able to take it. My optimism number, now that's tricky. I'm sitting here and I can hear the helicopters swirling over my house and I keep hearing sirens in the background. So I'm in a weird spot right now to be optimistic.
Are they coming for you specifically, or is this generally part of it?
Hopefully not. I don't think I've broken any laws today, although I might have jaywalked this morning, so I can't actually take that. Sorry. I'm actually not feeling that optimistic today. I've generally been more so. I'm going to give it a 6. And hopefully I will be proven wrong.
Wow. We were usually reliant on our American guests to get those 10s and 9s in early, but 6, okay. A fairly balanced middle of the road view. Terry, lovely to see you.
Always great to see you.
Hope it's not too long before we can have a beer, and I think you're on the bourbon in person. Perfect.
Bourbon seemed appropriate for today. Thank you.
Absolutely right. Lovely to see you, Terry. And Calvin, how are you feeling over, not necessarily the next 2 or 3 months? We don't quite know when this lockdown will end, but if we're beginning to get into the last stages of it, how do you see the UK in 2 to 3 years? How optimistic are you feeling?
To be honest, Mark, I'm feeling pretty black-pilled at the moment. I haven't gone full Peter Hitchens, but I'm not that optimistic at all. I think what worries me the most is how quickly we were willing to give up our freedoms, to give up our liberties, and the fact that no one's clambering for them back. Still, the people that are outliers, and they're being abused and called lockdown skeptics, and people are attacking the skeptics rather than defending lockdown at this point. So I'm really worried about the state of things, how big government has got. I don't think they're going to want to give up a lot of these restriction powers easily. I think for the next few years, winters are going to be very different. indeed. With the flu and with COVID and all these things, we're going to have different approaches to handling diseases going forward. It's all very worrying to me. The fact that schools have been closed for so long now, we've got a whole generation of young people that know nothing. So what are the consequences of that going to be? Not just for their mental health, their social development and their well-being, but just the fact that they're not going to be able to feel like they can contribute to society. We have kids with no GCSEs and no A-levels or made up grades because they haven't been able to sit their exams, and they've been almost, over a year out of school now at this point. And we've got the militant teachers' unions still arguing to keep them closed at this point. And Matt referred to, teachers shouldn't jump the list, and I agree completely. I argued in the Telegraph about this, that we should protect the vulnerable, let them get the jabs first, and if we give them to lobbyists groups like teachers, then we're taking jabs away from vulnerable people, which would be wrong. So yeah, all of it depresses me. It's all very negative. I'm trying to be positive. I'm not finding the light in the dark just yet. So I'll give you a number of 3.
3. You can always count on the Brits to be about half as optimistic as the Americans, or twice as pessimistic as the Americans. Calvin, it's been lovely to have you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us. Our 100th different guest in the history of Live with Littlewood today. Hope to see you again soon. Hope it's not too long before we might be able to meet in person. Calvin, thank you so much. And have a good evening. Matt, please stay with us. Just before we move on to our next topic, I'm doing my own bit for fiscal stimulus, not quite on the scale of President Joe Biden, but I give away, or offer to give away, if any of you can get the right answer, 50 quid of my own hard-earned cash. It's not IEA money, it's straight out of my wallet. They come by the IEA because they pay my salary, but it's my cash to do with what I want. I offer 50 quid of my own hard-earned cash to try and fiscally stimulate the life of one lucky viewer if they can answer a question. And I quite often go for US presidential questions. So I've got one today, and the question, which you can earn 50 quid if you can get it right, in terms of US presidential elections, in what way is Virginia ahead of Ohio? In terms of US presidential elections, in what way is Virginia ahead of Ohio? And if more than one person gets it right, the tiebreaker is going to be, and by how much? So in terms of US presidential elections, in what way is Virginia ahead of Ohio? And if you can say by how much, that will be the tiebreaker. If you got the answer, ping an email to lwl@iea.org.uk, and a lucky winner will win 50 quid of my money. Please do not write in the subject heading of the email, "This is not spam," because our spam filters pick that up as spam. So we might lose your entry if you put that in the heading. But anyway, good luck on those. I just see Tony Brown in the chat who's a bit worried I might be breaking the law if I don't isolate for 10 days coming back. That's right. Or I think I can reduce the isolation to 5 days as long as I get a test when I return. But I mean, talk about gold plating. I now need to test negative before I return to the UK and then isolate for 10 days. I mean, this is kind of, I kind of think that it should be one or the other, but I'm a law-abiding citizen, not mine to reason why, mine to abide by the law. So let's bring in another couple of guests and move on to our next topic. And Matt, please stay with us. We're going to welcome your thoughts on these. Universal approval, we're calling this next section of our discussion. I guess a little bit around universal credit, but let's be frank, that's a pretty small part of overall government spending. Of course, the political spat this week has been whether the government are at odds over, government ministers are apparently at odds, and that there were a few Conservative rebels on whether the current £20 per week uplift in universal credit should be extended either temporarily or indefinitely. The Labour Party, I think, has called for, I'm not sure if it's permanent or indefinite in terms of the extension, but there's probably not much difference between those. So this will be another £6 billion per annum were we to retain this £20 uplift. But small beer in the wider picture of the public finances for sure. But as Ronald Reagan said, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and before you know it, you're talking real money. I'm joined in this part of the programme by John O'Connell, my good friend and the Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance. Good evening to you, John. Lovely to have you with us.
Cheers, Mark. Nice to see you.
And Chris Snowdon, our very own scourge of the nanny state and head of lifestyle economics here at the IEA. Good evening to you, Chris.
Good evening, Mark. You all right?
I'm not too bad. I'm not too bad. It's still a lovely sunny evening here in Tenerife. I don't know how it is down in Sean.
Same.
Same, but absolutely glorious. So, John, let me start with you. I mean, obviously, universal credit's been the issue here. I've done one or two interviews about it because, as you'd expect, the IEA is pretty hawkish on government spending, but sceptical about its impact. Very worried about temporary schemes suddenly becoming permanent. I guess when all's said and done, it's not the most colossal amount of money. And I said in my interview of Newsnight earlier in the week that it's not the hill I'd want to die on, whether we extend universal credit uplift for another 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. But the wider picture on government spending is eye-wateringly bad and bleak, isn't it, John? I mean, it's now almost got out of control, and we're only arguing about whether we want to overspend by a colossal amount or an even more colossal amount.
Yeah, Mark, I think you're absolutely right. Universal credit uplift is not the hill to die on, whether it's for 4 weeks, 8 weeks, or whatever else in between. But I think the broader context is much more alarming. The way that the government are getting pushed around on some of these issues is quite concerning. I think some new MPs in particular are starting to realise that, even if you sort of offer something to the rabid left, they'll come back for even more. They're not going to say thank you for it. So, the politics of it are starting to play out, and new MPs are starting to realise, hang on a minute, it doesn't always work that if you give people more money, then they thank you for it. Quite often they say, well, where's the rest? So, the picture on public spending is absolutely abysmal. It's why we're doing a lot of work this year and at the back end of last year, but particularly more so this year, on how much government wastes in a given year. I think if we can make the argument that, out of the billions and hundreds of billions and probably pushing into the trillions in future years that government spends, then if we can identify the waste in that, then we're talking about priorities. If you're going to announce adding a new lane to a dual carriageway somewhere in Durham, that's all great. That's good news. I like the sound of that. But where's the spending cut that you're going to enact in order to pay for it? I think they're the questions that we need to be asking about priorities and about, are you getting value for money? And funnily enough, do you know what? It was Annalise Dodds that was on the agenda in recent weeks, with her speech, where she's talking about bringing the NAO much more into the picture and talking about value for money. And I think it shows that Keir Starmer really wants to drag Labour into the position where they're talking about value, they're talking about wasteful spending. So more power to their elbow, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
Chris, do you think we've now lost any sight of trade-offs in public spending? I mean, generally speaking, I think the panelists on this show would like in the round to see public spending to be enormously lower than it is. But what frustrates me in the debate, as John was saying, there's no sort of trade-off. I mean, nobody's saying, we will have the permanent £6 billion on universal credit, but we will cut NHS spending by £6 billion, or we'll cut school spending, or we'll abolish HS2, or whatever it might be. There never seems to be a trade-off. It's this programme is good and therefore it must continue. Doesn't really ask about value for money. And as John was saying, it doesn't seem to be, well, for every £6 billion you spend on that, you can't spend it on something else. And even worse than that, the public discourse has always been, well, if we can find the money for X, then we can find the money for Y. No, you bloody can't. If you've already spent the money on X, there's less for Y. In terms of the amount that the government can spend, it's more of a limited pie. Chris, where do you think we're at in the kind of terms of public discourse about public spending there?
Well, people don't see a trade-off because they don't see it as real money. I mean, in the sense that it's not connected to what taxpayers are paying in, and it isn't, and it hasn't been for nearly 20 years. I don't even know how much we borrowed last year. John probably does. I mean, it's something in the region of 400 billion. I could probably guess to within the nearest 20 billion. These are enormous sums of money. We won't be borrowing a lot less than that, I don't think, this year. So if you're going to borrow £400 billion in 1 year, albeit an unusual year, but you've been borrowing about, how much? $1 trillion over the course of the last decade anyway. And everybody virtually on left and right is saying it's not a problem, that it'll just roll over and we don't need to worry about inflation, we don't need to worry about interest rates, it's going to be okay. Then it's perfectly understandable if people will think, well, it's only $6 billion for universal credit, let's have that. if some factory closes down or some airline goes bust, oh, let's bail it out. It's only another 2.5 billion. It's only another 5 billion. I think it's one of the most damaging things from this whole pandemic, actually, is that everyone's now on the magic money tree. And how can you make any kind of argument for fiscal rectitude and prudence when we've been spending money and continue to spend money like we have? And apparently there's no harm to it, no short-term harm, no long-term harm. It's all right. It'll just get eaten away by inflation and economic growth.
So yeah, it's because people basically see no day of reckoning, I guess. Matt, what's your take on this? The present state of the public finances and also the present state of the debate about the public finances.
So I'm a little more sanguine than the other two on this. That the long-term interest rates are still real-term interest rates are still negative in both the USA and in real terms here in the UK as well. And so you can have some form of expansionary spending. And most of that is because the rest of the world is also in exactly the same position as the UK in terms of they are also looking at a pandemic. And so the question about sort of like more planning seems a little bit sort of obtuse to some. But in terms of that will very quickly change as the economy is able to rebound and bounce back. And so that sort of fiscal headroom becomes very much sort of very, very narrow. And so the government committing to large scale spending or increases in spending, and that sustained increase in spending, which would become a deficit over a long period of time, is very stupid and would be stupid to do. But you could spend, as you are doing now, on an immediate pandemic. Like the argument that you have a government credit card for a rainy day, if this is not a rainy day, then what is a rainy day, right? And so spending in order to avoid economic scarring makes sense right now. Corporate welfare makes sense right now. But there will have to be a point very soon where you have to let the forces of creative destruction come back in. And so as soon as you've got that clinically vulnerable group vaccinated, then you remove the restrictions on the economy and you allow companies to fail again. And that will be a very difficult moment for politicians to accept.
But Matt, isn't the problem this, that the money that you give people for a rainy day is, enjoyed, even necessary, I guess. So some people, 20 quid on universal credit, it's been an important
and then they become dependent, yeah.
And then you start saying, well, why not do it in sunny days as well, right? I mean, if you were giving them money when it rained, give them money when it was sunny. There doesn't seem to be any. I mean, Keynes would be spinning in his grave, right? The idea behind Keynesianism was you run a surplus in the good times, and obviously 2020 was the bad time. Then you're spending more than you're bringing in. But it's not as if that's been offset, because in 2014 and 2015, we were running big budget deficits. We weren't at all.
So it's not Keynesianism to say spend now, because Keynesianism is the idea that you peak and trough, right? You want to smooth out the peaks and troughs. But we're not doing that right now. What we're doing is suppressing an economy where we know that the latency is for more human interaction. What we're trying to do is stop economic activity because it's a proxy for human activity, because we want to stop as much human activity as possible and interaction so that we reduce the number of infections that you're getting from the virus. We know that as soon as you remove restrictions, and in fact, even when you've got restrictions, that people are still going and meeting each other, still having drinks and parties and so on, especially if you're a Welsh AM, apparently, assembly member, you're having parties in closed buildings. And so we know that as soon as you allow that restriction to be removed, that there will still be some pent-up demand that then comes back. And we saw that in the summer. And I think actually Tom's a little bit sort of negative and pessimistic before, when you say that the summer won't feel like the normal summer. I think it will actually. There's a lot of people who as soon as you've got the clinical vulnerable groups out of the way, and who maybe themselves have been infected in this past couple of months, will want to go out to their bars, see their friends, go to the beach, go out abroad and so on. And that will be much harder to try and control. Now, in terms of sort of like, maybe we should spend more. Well, actually, no, MMT is still not real. You can't continue to spend, and you can't create structural deficits. You can spend in the immediate term in order to put up a protection. But as soon as that period is over, the government has to get out of the way, drop the levers of trying to control every single part of the economy, and allow the market economy to take form again.
Yep. John, let me come back to you, because your key task at the TPA, you guys are excellent at pointing out egregious government programs and waste at all levels, especially at local government level. But you tell me where your thinking is with regard to the threat of tax rises, right? Because one part of a relatively fiscal conservative brain might say, well, look, we spent all of this. We've got to kind of balance the books. I'm afraid that's going to have to mean a new tax on property or stamp duty coming back or corporation tax up or you name it. How much do you think that's going to happen? Are we going to see a tax rising government because of the appalling state of the public finances? And B, what's the argument against the bean counters who say, well, if you're going to spend X, you've got to kind of make some sort of at least half-hearted effort to raise something like X?
Yeah, it's I change my mind every day on this, Mark, about what the government are going to do. I I think that they might not do a hell of a lot at this forthcoming budget. You know, come back at me and tell me I'm wrong in a couple of weeks' time on in early March. But I don't think they'll do all that much in this coming budget. I think it would be personally, I think it would be disastrous to try and tax your way out of this crisis, and particularly taxing the private sector, which has performed absolute heroics during this pandemic, to turn around and say, right, you've also got to cough up some money in tax. I think we've got to let the economy grow. We've got to grow our way out of this, really, and part of growth is low, sensible, simple taxation, right? And that means accepting a higher deficit for a period of time. That's fine. I mean, that comes with the territory, as we talked about with a rainy day. But some of the stuff that's been mooted, obviously, is corporation tax increases. Now, if they were to increase the headline rate of corporation tax, they should be looking at sort of countervailing measures. I know Matt at the ASI will talk a lot about this, but the factory tax and increasing investment allowance and things like that. So if they are going to increase the headline rate, they should definitely be looking at countervailing measures to boost growth. Other things that have been talked about are increases of council tax at the higher end. You know, maybe that won't make a huge difference at the margins. There are fairly big houses in London that you could argue pay the same council tax as a smaller house down the road. But I think they should be looking at other tax cuts, really. They should be looking at employers' national insurance for a start. And if we really want to have a sort of hiring boom after, post-pandemic and into the summer and beyond, then we should be looking at slashing the jobs tax on employers' national insurance. So it shouldn't just be all about tax hikes to balance the books. We should accept a higher deficit in the meantime to get growth going.
John, how strong do you think some Laffer curve arguments are? I mean, the Laffer curve obviously makes total sense in theory. I don't really know anybody who disagrees with it in theory, that at some point taxes would be so high that revenues would actually be increased if you cut the tax rate. But obviously it's extremely difficult to know in practice whether the peak of the Laffer curve for CGT is 18%, 22% or 14%. Do you think there are any taxes which you could say with confidence, probably not with scientific certainty, might now be on the wrong side of the Laffer curve? Things like employers' NICs, I'm very sympathetic to what you say because it helps the supply side of the economy. But do you think there are taxes, I don't know, it would be unpopular, I guess, to say so, but the top rate of income tax, where you could actually reduce the rate and not see any fall in revenues and perhaps even see an increase in revenues?
Well, the government did some work themselves on this, or previous government, sorry. They did some work on dynamic tax modeling on fuel duty and corporation tax way back when, I think in 2012, 2013 kind of time. And they found that actually the reductions in those taxes were bringing in more money. So the same with reducing the 50p rate of income tax. So the Treasury are aware of this. I think part of the problem is that was an experiment. You know, generally the Treasury operates this mindset of a static model where if you reduce a tax by X, then the revenue goes down by Y, when we all know that in the real economy, that's not kind of what happens. You change incentives and, you know, if you cut stamp duty, then a person buying a house might hire some painters, decorators, and you know, you start to get that sort of virtuous flow of economic growth that way. So I think a change in the mindset of the Treasury is part of the problem here. They operate in the static world, and they're not helped, even though they do excellent work, they're not helped by groups like the IFS who operate with static models and are seen as basically gods by the BBC. We need to see a much more dynamic analysis of the economy in order to make the case that it's not just about, reducing a tax by X brings in more revenue in Y. It's actually about the incentive effects and the second round effects in the economy.
Chris, virtually all of the issues that you write about for us at the IA, the taxes are on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, aren't they? Booze, fags, for sure. How do you think we should tackle the tax debate? And, should we be a bit dovish about the deficit? Amortize this like it's a war debt. Don't, for God's sake, start hiking income tax or corporation tax or anything else. You'll choke off the recovery. Back in 2010, when the coalition came in, folks at the IEA were very hawkish. Cut government spending, balance the books, balance the books. Is it time to be a bit more dovish on the state of the books and to take our battle on the tax side of the ledger and make sure that tax, well, I was going to say goes down, but at least doesn't go up?
Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it? I mean, the trouble is, I mean, you've almost alluded to that already, that we need to be a little bit more dovish on debt, because we're going to come out of the coronavirus and then we've got a lot of problems doing that. And this is a point, you see, there's always a rainy day. That's the whole trouble with Matt's analogy about the credit card. It only works if you only have a rainy day every 50 years or something. But we had the financial crisis, lots of borrowing, lots of printing money. Then the recession after the financial crisis, you've got to keep the economy going, got to put more in. Then we have Brexit. Oh dear, things are going bad. We better put money. We can't let the economy decline. Then COVID. And then after COVID, we're going to have 3 or 4 million people out of work. It's going to need another Keynesian boot. And it will never end. It doesn't end. And I just don't think we're ever going to see the days again. Like, I think it was 1998, Bill Clinton balanced the books in America, big day. Round about the same time the Tories balanced. No, a little bit before that.
Labour, 2001. It was a Labour government.
No,
Yeah,
they'd been
4 years. The Labour government balanced the books. Yeah.
Yeah, but the Tories did it initially, I think, and then Labour stuck to their spending plans.
Yeah, they stuck.
But anyway, the point is,
plans.
I just don't think we'll see those days again in my lifetime. And because of democracy, basically, unless we go through a 1970s period of stagflation because of all this money printing and borrowing, then I don't think anything will make people make that connection again between money in and money out. And why should they? And so there'll always be something to spend the money on, whether it's HS2 or leveling up or this and that. Oh, there's still people out of work. Let's create jobs. It won't end because people have lost all sense of economic understanding, really. So that's, I think, hopefully where the IEA comes in, is give people some basic economic understanding. If they don't want to increase, increase taxes or lower taxes or whatever, but at least let's get back to some kind of normal classical economics.
Matt, let me have your thoughts. I see Peter Gill has said in the YouTube chat, Mark may not know this, but it's very rainy today in the UK. It's very sunny today in Tenerife. So I guess you're getting the money, you can spend the credit card on you, and I'll have to go without because the sun is shining. But Matt, on Chris's sort of, well, not really apocalyptic point, but almost a sort of death spiral point. I mean, if at some point this isn't sustainable, and things which are not sustainable can't forever be sustained. When, Matt, do you think there might be a day of reckoning? If Chris is right that there's always a crisis, there's always a problem, there's always a reason why it's raining, and therefore we have to do this right now because we've got to get through this period. I mean, what's the crunch point? The government fails in a bond issue? Where does this all end in 5, 10, 20, 30 years' time? Do we all end up a bit like Greece eventually, even if that isn't an immediate threat in the next 18 months or so?
Well, the obvious answer to that is that I would say that the financial crisis, bailing out, I wouldn't have done it. Would I have had stimulus spending post that? No. Would I have stimulus spending post this? No. But do I think that a pandemic does provide a reason for why you might want to do something? Yes. But then the other is, well, what is the crunch point? Well, obviously, as you just alluded to, you could have a bond issue failure. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And actually, the long rate sort of refinancing suggests that's not going to happen. But
so do you think interest rates
no
will remain
will
interest rates remain on the floor forever, Matt? Is that what's changed?
No, I don't think that they will. I think that they have done for a very long period of time. I think the obvious way in which this happens is that the value of what we're able to purchase declines. The government uses inflation to try and get its way out of its debt problem. and that comes at the expense of all of our living standards. The UK government, of course, actually has within its gift many ways in which it could increase our living standards relatively quickly through supply-side reforms. If it wanted to increase inward investment, it could do, as we say, the factory tax. It could do reductions on tax coming into the UK, capital gains and so on. It could do massive house building or allowing massive house building supply on that. It could to increase the purchasing power based on reduction in rent. It could do supply side reform on childcare to reduce the amount of that parents pay. So there's all sorts of things the government could do if it wants to increase standards of living. The fact that it failed to do so time and time and time again because it won't take on its own coalitions, which is a failing of our politics. But that's not what we're here to discuss today, I think.
No, you're right. So it's not all about fiscal policy. You're right. There's a lot of supply side reform that, with political courage, boosts growth for free, basically.
Yeah, and all domestic and all within the gift. And now we no longer have, the European Union to blame for various things. Now that actually, as Boris says, we've taken back control, all of our laws here in the UK are now made here in the UK. We should do it. And in fact, if they don't do it, we should hold them to account. And if they don't do it for long periods of time, young people should stop voting for them like they have done. And they should never vote for them. And it will sort of like, and to be quite honest with you, I think there should be a YIMBY party. I think there should be a party that creates intergenerational warfare, probably, if they fail continuously to do so.
Up the revolution.
Up democratic revolution. I think that's a reasonable response.
And so, Matt, with that warning, where are you on the Live with Littlewood optimism barometer between an integer?
Well, my mum got vaccinated last week. I just watched a peaceful transition of the President of the United States, and they are ramping up vaccinations, and we are still ahead of most of Europe. So it does look like some people will be able to have rosé in the sun with their friends and family, and maybe a couple of weddings as a treat. So I'm going to say
you can do it today here in my hotel. I don't know why everybody's
Yeah, it's an 8 from me. Let's be happy on a miserable day.
Well done, Matt. Lovely to have you. See you soon if I ever make it back to London. Chris and John, please stay with us. And we're going to move. We have to cover this topic every week. I'm not quite sure for how much longer, but Brexit has happened. It's done. After all of the bloody wrangles and everything, it has finally happened. We are 20 days in. I greatly enjoyed watching the news channels sending reporters down to Dover, desperately looking for a catastrophe, and truck drivers saying, no, everything's pretty normal, mate. So what has happened? I mean, we were warned way back in the day that we could see all sorts of problems, customs chaos, empty supermarket shelves, shortage of medicine supplies. Well, we might have that with regard to the vaccine, but in general, the apocalypse doesn't seem to have arisen. Things have gone relatively smoothly, but on the other hand, at least so far, not much has changed from what I can see. So to take the temperature on what we think of Brexit, the story so far, basically 3 weeks of Brexit. It's a warm welcome back to the show to Ali Renison. Lovely to have you with us, Ali. Thank you for joining us. Happy New Year to you. And a welcome to the show to Christian Calgie from the Guido Fawkes website. You are now our 101st different guest on Live with Us. We'll send you a plaque and a medal and all of that. Celebrate it. Ali, let me start with you. I'm being a little bit cheeky here to pick up some of the more apocalyptic predictions that were potentially made, but other than a few sort of rather petty stories about people being stopped by Dutch customs officials and having to hand over their ham sandwich, so far it's been pretty frictionless, hasn't it? Or am I being too optimistic?
I think you're being pretty optimistic. I say that because people's reference point was January 1st, and actually low freight volumes because it's the holidays. You've got people who've done their actual stockpiling, and so I think there's a reason that you have people like Michael Gove saying it's going to get worse before it gets better, because now, and I'm probably a little bit biased because I'm on the border delivery group calls every single day with government, and I can hear the sort of concerns. I think now there was a really bad point last week where Ashford Waterbrook in Kent was definitely having a huge amount of turnbacks. You've heard about the sort of people, I won't even go into the seafood aspect, we can go into that later if we want. The government is sort of having to frantically cobble together kind of compensation schemes, even though there aren't technically tariffs, because they give people a week to adjust. So, unfortunately, it's going to get worse before it gets better, and that's what we're seeing. The question is as to how much this temporary disruption to trade that we are now seeing, because stockpiling's running out, freight volumes returning to normal, people are trying to figure out, I'm actually glad that people aren't doing a huge amount of travel right now, because I think the impact of ending free movement has been mitigated quite significantly by that. So definitely not frictionless. But the point is that it was always a mistake, in my opinion, to sort of view the prism through leaving aside the apocalyptic predictions. I think people focus too much on that counterfactual. But it was always about the paperwork and the bureaucracy, and not about the checks themselves, because that's what turns people off from wanting to trade with the UK. And what I think the government's trying to do now is trying to make sure that it's putting out lots of fires at the moment, which is why it set up this huge compensation scheme for the fishermen who are unhappy about barriers, and also the fact that basically fishing hasn't really massively changed in terms of access to waters for the next 5 years. So I think in summary, the big question is this teething problems or is this permanent?
John, I know you've got to leave us in a few minutes. So John, let me come back to you just for your thoughts. Brexit, is it going smoothly? Is it going well? Or does it turn out this wasn't really much to get excited about one way or the other? I mean, I voted for leave. I used to be very fond of the European Union. I thought the single market had the potential to be a free market enterprise. I think it kind of wavered from that. But is there kind of, John, just sort of nothing to see here, really? It turns out it doesn't matter enormously whether you're in the EU or not, if I'm right. Or is Ali right that actually there's a danger that we've taken back control, but actually that means that there's just a lot of British paperwork and bureaucracy to go through rather than one rule of law?
We're quite good at paperwork and bureaucracy and queuing and all the rest of it. You're sort of both right, I think. As ever, with all of these things that are built up politically over so many years, they turn out to be sort of a big nothing. But as Ali's outlining, there are some real concerns that are facing different industries. I was listening to the radio this morning. I know Ali sort of skipped over the fishing industry, but I heard the head of the Scottish fishing industry on the Today programme this morning, and he was much more. He was a Brexiteer, I've got to say, but he was much positive about this. He called it, this is our first day at school. We've got some problems. We will over them, and we will sort them out in course. And maybe I want to think this, but I like to think that is the case. That these are teething problems that we're going to get at the start. Ali will tell me off for this, I'm very, very sure. But these are teething problems that we're going to have now, and we will sort out over the course of the next few months. Hopefully next few months, if not next year or so. But I'm much more sanguine. I think it's going to be obviously a good thing for the UK, just with some teething problems along the way.
So, John, overall, not particularly related to Brexit, although that's an aspect of it, give me your optimism number for how optimistic or pessimistic you're feeling at the moment, and just to remind you of the parameters. It's an integer between 0 and 10. I still haven't worked out whether 0 is an integer, but a whole number between 0 and 10, where 10 would be that in 2 to 3 years' time, Britain is a blooming, prosperous, free society. Near libertarian utopia has been achieved, and 0 is we're worse than North Korea.
All right. Well, you've asked me relatively similar questions in the past, and what I've done is taken my answer and added one just to be a bit more optimistic. But this time I'm going to take my answer and subtract one. So I'm going to go for 6. I think that my old mate Chris Snowdon would often say, "Everything will be fine. It will be fine. Don't worry about it."
I don't say that anymore, John. That was that's an old one.
Right. You want a 4 then? I think that we'll muddle through. We do tend to do so. I think the vaccine rollout's going pretty well, and we'll all be feeling a bit better about things in the summer. So I'm going to go for a 6, but with lots more work to do, particularly on the fiscal side.
John, been lovely having you with us.
Cheers,
been
Mark.
good to
Enjoy
see
the
you
sunshine.
virtually a few times. I will, but it won't be too many weeks are out before I see you, and hopefully we can have a proper English pub, English pint in an English pub before. Lovely to see you,
Cheers,
John.
mate. What's up?
Kristen, sorry to keep you waiting. Let me come to you. What do you make of how Brexit has gone so far? I think it was actually on the Guido website you highlighted one particular, I'm not trying to put all of the Remainers together. Some have been more inaccurate than others, but Dave Keating, a Brussels correspondent for France 24, tweeted in March last year, if a vaccine for coronavirus is developed next year, it will be difficult and expensive for the UK to get it because it will have left the EU's drug procurement mechanism on the 1st of January. That is, if Johnson chooses not to extend the Brexit transition period. Of course, so far, so good. We're ahead of the EU on vaccinations. One prediction, only one metric. What's your take, Christian, on how smoothly it's going? Should we all be celebrating the fantastic new freedom we've got? Or is there just more bloody paperwork and it's just got the Union Jack at the top of it instead of the 12 European stars?
Yes, you're right. It is great British paperwork now. There's a lot to be said that a lot of Remainers are incredibly disappointed so far that we are not in a world of fire and brimstone at this current juncture. Thank goodness. Teething problems is a good way to put it, and I'm sure they will ramp up. And I'm also rather worried specifically for Northern Ireland. George Osborne came out with an article this morning that was not very helpful to the branding of the union, but I think there's a grain of truth in saying that because of the particular Brexit deal that's been negotiated, Northern Ireland looks more now to Dublin than it did before for its economic future. On the rest of the teething problems, well, it's very difficult to know precisely how things are going, because can we trust the media to fairly portray these things? One of the other hilarious incidents we reported at the start of the year was the BBC sending correspondents to Dover, hoping to get scenes of chaos, and they had to shut down their live blog and apologise for using a photograph from 2020, I think it was, or 2019. It was completely misleading. So it may very well be the case that a lot of the issues are particular one-offs that the media are wanting to hype because it provides a very interesting narrative going forward.
Chris, let me come back to you. You were a Brexiteer, Chris. I think you more or less told me that it was the only topic that united all of the various different opinions held by people at your local snooker club, was that they were all at least for Brexit. Are they celebrating the fantastic freedom that we're all experiencing since the 1st of January came around? I mean, tell me what the great benefits have been since New Year's Day.
Well, there's been money off tampons, I gather. So that's good. I guess.
The whole referendum was worth it then. Yeah.
The tax has gone on tampons. So, yeah, it's a tax cut. I'll take that. I can't think of anything else. I can't think of much too disastrous. I mean, you bring up the Northern Ireland. I have heard there are quite big problems in Northern Ireland with paperwork. And effectively, it's now easier to source things if you're in Northern Ireland from Southern Ireland or from the EU than it is from Britain. So that is a big problem. But you're right, in terms of like the visual aspects of it, the 50-mile tailbacks and all this stuff. No, of course, we haven't seen it. I think Sky News managed to find some guy in Kent who breeds eels, and he's a Brexiteer, and he's not sure now whether he will still be able to sell as many eels to the EU. Which I thought was a fairly lame, a lame story.
For the wider economy
compared to what we were compared to what we were kind of promised. But that's a problem partly with promising disaster. It's a bit like the NHS. You know, the NHS is going to collapse. Like the NHS at the moment, many hospitals at least, they are collapsing right now. You know, they haven't seen anything worse than this, but it's not a visual thing. It means in practice that elective surgery and a lot of various other appointments get cancelled and a lot of people get substandard treatment. But it never collapses. They're like the same as the NHS can't go bust. People use these exaggerated terms. And then when things get really bad, because it hasn't matched that, people go, oh, this has gone okay. I went out and bought, well, I didn't go out, obviously, but I went on Amazon and bought this book by Ian Dunt, The Day We Finally Left Once and For All. Never read it before. You can pick up copies very, very cheaply, would you believe it, secondhand. So I'm going to read this, and I'm also going to. I've already read this one. I'm going to reread this by Dan Hanan, similar name, but one has a slightly more hysterical title than the other, and see who was closest to the truth. I suspect that Ian's might have been a little bit fear-mongering, and Dan's might have been a little bit too optimistic, but I'll see when I read them together. So, I mean, no, we haven't seen obvious catastrophe, but, I think things have got at least marginally worse in the short term, and we can only make up for that by doing lots of things that we couldn't do in the EU to make things better.
Ali, without getting too technical, I'm interested in hearing from you, if you can kind of put them in layman's terms, the sort of problems that businesses that you're dealing with are experiencing. Is it that they don't know which form to fill in? Is it that the form is incredibly complicated and they need to spend £1,000 on a lawyer or an accountant to fill it in for them? Give me a sense, kind of in general terms, about what this bureaucratic problem is. And then give me your prescription about how to solve it. I mean, let's say we're going to be out of the EU now, the deal is done, like it, lump it. How, if these problems are arising, almost whatever their scale, whether they're minor, medium, or colossal, what's the prescription? What do you and the IOD think should be done to fast stream it, make it easier, make it automated? Will that just be learning by doing? Or are there some levers that the government could pull to make the paperwork less burdensome?
I mean, the source of it, and this isn't a Remainery point, this is just factual. So, was the fact that you gave people 7 days, and I will tackle the whole you've had 4 years to adjust or prepare for it, so to speak, in a second. You gave people who were affected 7 days to adjust to the actual detail of all the new forms they have to deal with. So, for example, DHL, we've read now, is refusing shipments. Part of this is actually to do with EU businesses not being as ready, which is interesting because the EU did start off saying that they weren't, their industry didn't lobby for any particular type of arrangement. They just wanted people to be prepared. Well, now you're having EU institutional employers bodies saying, oh my gosh, we need an adjustment period a week after the transition period ends, which is like, a bit late, guys. But beyond that,
but that's a short-term problem, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
but you say that though, and this is the question, is that, if you look at our importing members, right? And I'm not saying that is necessarily relevant to the whole of Europe, but the number one reason that our members import is because they can't find it in the UK. And if you were to extrapolate that to the rest of Europe, that I think answers the question to some degree about, is the short-term disruption or permanent, right? If they can find alternative source of supplies, they're just going to go with that. So there's a reason that, for example, Scottish fishermen are now landing catch in Denmark because it's just easier to deal with without paperwork, and not having that adjustment period made this impact way worse than it needed to be. The question now is that how permanent are those arrangements? How much can you mitigate them? How much can you make up for them? And I think one of the frustrating things for me seeing is that the government seems more interested on its trade policy and talking about what the state can do, talking about sort of a values-based trade policy instead of buddying up with X, Y, and Z in these countries, which is great, but that's not necessarily talking about what actually helps businesses trade. And unlike the US, that is used to being a country and an economy that depends on its own domestic market share to advance itself, the UK has always been, as an island nation, fairly dependent on trade. So in this sense, I think it would be welcome to see, number one, this agreement is supposed to be a living agreement to an extent. It's supposed to have structures under it that allow you to carry on, I wouldn't say negotiating with the EU, but trying to sort of have committees to talk about where you can cut down on some of the bureaucracy that you're seeing. And we are seeing actually the Irish government saying, look, here, these are some of the easements that we need to talk about. So I know it's sort of like in vogue to kind of bash the Irish, but we really shouldn't be, because the Irish still have more of our economic interest at heart than the rest of the continent, quite frankly. So we should be sort of pushing that forward. But secondly, don't just diverge for the sake of diverging, and don't just make it about where do we cut EU red tape. It's exhausting to see it just focused on, because of Brexit, we only focus on EU areas around the Working Time Directive. The ironic thing about the Working Time Directive is that the biggest challenge for business around the Working Time Directive has not been the working hours itself, because there's been an opt-out, and most people that I know, blue collar, white collar, whatever, they use that opt-out, has been actually the application of EU court decisions in this respect. So that's sort of gone now from the focus. I think it's important to look at, number one, where we can actually talk with the EU about trying to introduce further easements, and I think particularly around the Northern Ireland Protocol. Secondly, look at specifically regulations in the main. Don't just look at EU regulations like the tampon tax, just say the tick mark, we did something. Like, try and actually do an impact assessment and say what's going to help business rather than just do it for the sake of it. It's don't diverge for the sake of it. Actually try and consult not only industry, because I think what we don't, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, we don't want to end up like the US, where I think, particularly on trade, there's total state capture by business and certain specific lobby interest groups, but actually try and consult industry on what's going to help them right now, rather than just doing a cosmetic exercise.
Christian, let me come back to you, because the kind of trailblazing libertarian triumph that Brexit was supposed to be, well, are there any signs of this? On Monday, Boris Johnson held talks with business leaders about cutting red tape, and ministers were told to draw up plans to turn Britain into the Singapore of Europe. I hope that doesn't mean we're bringing capital punishment for jaywalking, but I hope that's focused on the economic side of the economy. Now we've left the European Union. He spoke to 30 senior leaders around topics such as regulatory freedoms. Rishi Sunak's been charged with leading a cross-Whitehall committee requiring departments to closely examine which regulations can be reformed. Are we actually going to see liberalisation post-Brexit? And to Ali's point, is there a danger that this all just becomes kind of political posturing? You know, we've got a point at 82 EU regulations we've got rid of, even though there's 82,000 British regulations that would be much better to throw on the furnace.
I'm sure that a huge part of the next 5 years of Britain's narrative is going to be posturing. I think the biggest story, the biggest indicator on this recently was the Financial Times story regarding Bays, who have started looking at standard divergence. There was specific reference to the Working Time Directive. And, you know, this is at the most preliminary stage that a department can be at when it comes to policy making. But already there was an incredible backlash from everyone, from unions, from Labour. There was pretty biased coverage in the BBC, I seem to remember. So what the government has to brace for are big intellectual arguments and debates over the next 5 years, something which, because we've not been able to set many of these laws for so long, politicians have almost become very rusty at, and they need to be prepared to be pretty unpopular in the immediacy of divergence. What we've got to assume is that because the negotiation went right up to the wire over the country's ability to diverge, that Boris Johnson plans on doing something with that, given he almost risked the deal over it. But my particular worry for the government is specifically about some of these new MPs who are very new to politics, may not remember the unpopularity of the Tory party, especially during the coalition austerity years, and may not be ready for the intellectual and political battles ahead.
Christian, what do you think? I wrote, I'll try and get our guys to put it in the YouTube chat. I wrote a suggestion, and I'm very conscious of what Ali has said. We shouldn't just tackle EU regulation because it's called EU regulation. There's a lot of domestic regulation we need to look at as well. But my suggestion was, at least as a starting point, we should look at regulations or rules that were adopted despite the fact that the UK opposed them, but were adopted by the EU via the qualified majority voting mechanism. I don't know what all of these are. One springs to mind is the Agency and Part-Time Workers Directive that David Cameron was adamant he wanted to stop. I'm not aware that the Conservative Party leadership has changed its mind since. The UK voted against it. It was imposed upon us. Why would we retain any rules or regulations that we voted against but lost the vote on QMV? Very much in the foothills, not saying, to address Ali's point, that these will be the most important regulations or the most burdensome, but wouldn't you think a process like that would at least give you a framework for beginning to torch some red tape at least? Christian.
Oh, sorry. No, that's a very good idea. Not one that I'd heard of before, but if I were in government, I think it would be very sensible to get the new business secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, Rishi Sunak, Boris around the table with the stakeholders and the advisors and do precisely that. It's a very good place to start. I, again, am not going to comment on individual policies, but the government is, I think, not only spoiling to demonstrate its newfound independence, but will deep down be reaching for those traditional free market values in the wake of the pandemic and the economic ruin that will lie ahead of us in trying to get jobs moving. I mean, I was doing research earlier this week, and there are a number of figures that have been put on potentially scrapping the working time directive. 60,000 jobs was one of the figures that could be potentially generated from liberalising some of the employment regulation in this country. And that is going to be the government's priority for the next few years.
Ali, I can see you want to come back in briefly, and then I want to come to Chris. Ali.
Yeah, just one thing that, and this isn't one thing that I think the government, and I'm not going to go into discussions behind closed doors, but some of the things that the messages that we do get behind closed doors with ministers is we're not trying to do it for the sake of it, although there are certain areas where we will. And one thing you have to be mindful of is that there are non-regression clauses in the UK-EU agreement. I won't get into the level playing field arguments, because I think actually in some respects the EU talks a good game on the LPF stuff, but actually is a bit nervous about bringing any kind of provisions that it might lose necessarily. But you have to remember as well that one of the things that we have to be mindful of a little bit is from an investment perspective, businesses, particularly foreign businesses, aren't going to want to do a huge amount of investment if they think that there are going to be constant battles between everywhere where the government seems to sort of poke a toe and brief it out that it wants to sort of scrap regulations, and then, you know, decides actually in substance it doesn't want to do that much because it might attract tariffs. So keep that in mind, is that, you know, from an investment perspective, people don't want to be seeing the UK constantly at war with the EU. I understand some people might want to wear tariffs with a badge of honor like the Russians wear sanctions, but that's not where the UK wants to be at the end of the day. We may not like the fact that we have agreed an agreement that basically makes it able to attract tariffs, but that creates a certain amount of instability. And I'm not saying that you can't deregulate in any way because of what we've agreed to. We do have more autonomy now. Having said that, I'd like to get back to impact assessments, how we do regulation, not regulatory change, rejection writ large, but actually think about the trade impact of it. Because if we're doing stuff that attracts tariffs, that makes it, you know, what are the actual trade-offs? Can Brexit, with or Brexit, how to do Brexit, that conversation now behind us? Can we have a discussion now about everything that we do? Is there a trade impact or not? And I think that we should be doing that. That's not to say that we shouldn't deregulate, but there are different dimensions to think about, including doing stuff that may attract tariffs and instability in that relationship.
So, Ali, do you have anything for the chopping block? I mean, the IOD must have some regulations they want to get rid of, surely.
So I think, interestingly, one of the areas that is going to be most interesting is in financial services. It was interesting before the referendum, Mark Carney, even though he's the bête noir of some Brexiteers, Mark Carney came out, one of the few speeches he gave on Brexit, basically said that EU regulation in financial services sometimes makes it harder to go both below and above beyond it. And so I actually think that even though the UK and the EU are about to get together and decide, because financial services wasn't really part of the negotiations at all, they are going to get together, discuss equivalence. I think that's one of the areas where we already have that kind of divergence almost inbuilt. We don't have the market access to the EU passporting anymore. So I think financial services in particular is one area that we should be looking at.
Chris, what should we be throwing on the bonfire? Is there anything in your neck of the woods? I'm really interested in how we approach the question of regulation. I mean, oftentimes people say, give me a list of the 10,000 regulations you want to get rid of. Each regulation oftentimes isn't particularly important in itself. So I'm very interested in the processes by which we investigate this and throw things overboard, in addition to my suggestion that we should repeal stuff that was imposed upon us because of QMV. My other suggestion was we should actually just sunset clause the entire acquis, all of it. Now, we might renew it. That's fine. We can look at what's on the statute books from the EU and decide we're going to retain it all for some of the reasons Ali's given. But perhaps the default should be repeal rather than retain. Chris, do you have any thoughts about what we should get rid of? I mean, or are we just going to be waving the Union Jack, celebrating the newfound freedom that women have when they buy Tampax?
Well, you know, I mean, as you allude to, I've got a fairly narrow interest in all the nanny state stuff. And I find generally when I speak to people in business, any type of business, they know the kind of regulations they want to get rid of, and they seem fairly trivial, or you might not even understand what they are because it's their thing. Similarly, I mean, this is my e-cigarette. It's a bit old and battered because it's a very hardy device. That is illegal. That's where you keep the e-cigarette fluid. That's illegal under EU law because it contains more than 2 millilitres. Why is there a ban on having more than 2 millilitres of e-cigarette fluid in a bottle? God knows. There's no real reason for it. You look at the bottles of themselves, that's the maximum size you can have, 10 mils. It creates an enormous amount of plastic waste, apart from anything else, actually. And they all have to come with various leaflets warning about this and that. Oh, totally, classic Brussels bureaucracy. No logic behind it whatsoever. We could get rid of all that stuff straight away. I think we probably voted against it. I'm not 100% sure. I know that certainly the Lib Dems were against it. That's the kind of thing. Now, that might not seem a very big deal, but you get hundreds and hundreds of laws like that, and you make people's lives a little bit better, and you save quite a bit of money, and you boost the economy a little bit. I've said for years the government should be doing a road show, going around Britain, speaking to businessmen and women, particularly small businessmen and women, because the big corporates often quite like a lot of these regulations because it raises the barriers to entry. Speak to people who are starting out. What is it that's getting in their way? And Ali's obviously quite right. We can apply this to British regulation absolutely as much as we can to the EU. I think that's what needs to be done. But a lot of these people, they don't have the trade organisations, they don't have the clout to get their voice known. Is it likely? I don't know. I mean, at the moment, the government's looking to clamp down on online gambling, and it's already said it's going to ban, all sorts of food adverts and stuff. So I've never seen anything about Boris Johnson, much as I kind of like the guy, really. Never seen anything to justify this label he's managed to get of being a libertarian. You get rid of his Spectator and Telegraph articles, and he's never done anything that I know of as a politician suggests he's interested at all in libertarianism or deregulation.
He writes like a libertarian, but he governs like a socialist. Ali, you want to come in very briefly? So I want to bring Christian back in very briefly.
I mean, one of the things that I noticed, keeping in mind that when we've asked over 4 years, the IOD members, it's been about 2/3 prioritized EU market access. The third said that they prioritize being able to diverge. But even if you ask that third of business who want to be able to diverge what the questions were, and I know it's not as sexy to talk up, but actually a lot of the benefit that they see was not being able to have to automatically adopt future regulation. And so maybe that's harder for the government to sell, but I think that's more relevant, quite frankly, than sort of necessarily going through the statute book. I would also say, by the way, that gold plating is something we should start at. And you mentioned QMV sort of based decision making where the UK is opposed to it. I actually think an equally interesting place to start is all the stuff that the UK has gone over and above. Because, yes, it was a Labour government, but the Working Time Directive had 4 weeks annual leave entitlement, and then Blair's government added an extra week. So there's a lot of extra stuff that we could undo in that space to start off with at a bare minimum.
Christian, do you think, how optimistic are you about this Singapore-on-Thames sort of vision? Do you think the government's going to deliver anything much on this in terms of deregulation, or is it all for Telegraph columns, not actually for parliamentary divisions?
Yes, I'm afraid I wouldn't put more than a 1 or 2 out of 10 in terms of an optimism scale on these Singapore plans, frankly, because I think it returns to a lot of the debates you were having before we moved on to Brexit in the context of COVID. I mean, if you ask Rishi Sunak, is he going to start chopping up a swathe of taxes? I don't feel like he is. At the very best we're going to get is maintaining the current standards. And I also think that there's a lot of potential and popularity for the government here. If we turn back to that posturing point about Tampax, actually that was a major initial victory for the government. It might be slightly laughable, it might seem slightly paltry, but it was a thing it could tick off. It was a bit social justice-y. It was a tax cut. And as long as by the end of the next 4-year government, we've got an independent border policy, we've continued checking off all the countries that we want to do trade deals with, the government will frankly be quite happy enough with that.
Interesting. So, Chris, you're not going to be particularly confident that we're going to become Singapore-on-Thames, are you? I mean, we're on the defensive, us classical liberals for sure, right? But do you also think that you can't get any of these deregulation arguments over the line? I mean, Kwasi Kwarteng hadn't been business secretary for 5 minutes before everybody was panicking that there might be any sort of change at all to any employment laws. How very dare you? Surely we have inherited and legislated for the absolute perfect employment regulatory environment over the past 30 years. There is not a single jot, dot or comma that we should examine or change without people going apoplectic. Do you think that just means we can't get this off the ground? And maybe, Chris, the benefit won't so much be in the stock of regulations, it might be in the flow. Perhaps over the next 20 years, the EU will bring in lots more heavy regulations about the size of bottles, and we will simply benefit by them not automatically applying to us. It might be the flow that's the real benefit here, rather than trying, or will try as I will, to tackle the stop. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, you take something like pesticides as a very good example. I mean, we got out of the EU just in time, as far as I'm concerned. This is something my dad has a bit of a bee in his bonnet about, because he's a small farmer. He has a small farmer. He's not a midget. He's a small farm, and he has, over the years, one by one, all these pesticides and herbicides that actually work have been progressively banned, and there's almost nothing left apart from Roundup. And the French will eventually push the EU to banning Roundup, and then it's all over.
What's Roundup? I'm not a farmer.
It's glyphosate, also known as. It's a brand name of glyphosate. It's an amazing thing. It basically kills everything but the one thing you want to keep growing. It's extraordinary, but the anti-scientists at Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace are constantly pushing for it to be banned. There was this controversy last week, wasn't there, about neonicotinoids, and is the government going to legalise neonicotinoids? This would be absolutely awful. It turns out actually they're not banned in the EU. This is how ignorant the people who were protesting about it were, and nor should they be banned. But they will be, almost certainly be banned, because they're supposedly bee killers and all the rest of it. So yeah, I mean, moving forward, we will certainly benefit from the EU just banning everything steadily. But I think we might need more than that. I mean, let's not underestimate how awful the next year or two, is going to be, I think. So we need a massive push for growth. And will the government do it? I don't know. I think I mentioned this kind of going back to the 70s thing before. I honestly think at this stage that's the only thing that's going to bring people to their senses. We need to essentially just go over what we did in the 70s and 80s with a similar kind of response from someone like Thatcher.
Well, I'm going to come back to you last, Chris, because there's also been some questions for you in the chat. Ali, let me have your closing thoughts, and particularly how optimistic you are about the UK as a free and prosperous economy over a 2 to 3 year time horizon. Are some of the problems that you've highlighted at the moment short term? Hopefully we'll be out of this goddamn pandemic in, 2, 3, 4 months' time, and something like normality can return. But maybe normality won't be enough. We might need to do something a bit more radical than that.
Yeah, it depends on, I'm in Washington at the moment, but if I was back in the UK, I live in Scotland, so I'm a little bit, probably a little bit more pessimistic, because I feel like the precautionary instinct generally across regulation and restrictions writ large may be here to stay to some extent, even when people get vaccinated. So if I was in Scotland, I might feel a bit more pessimistic. But generally speaking, I think the question, if I were to frame it around Brexit, is the question, as much as we want to think is gone, is still there, is doing things domestically different enough to compensate for loss of market access? One of the things that I've always had a bugbear of mine on EU regulation has been, for example, on bovine TB. I know that sounds crazy, but it's basically tuberculosis in cows, and we couldn't actually do that because the EU wouldn't allow for sort of differentiation. And even Labour, I remember, on the side of sort of trying to move away from the EU side, but it's a bit like pharmaceuticals, right? If you just change things for the UK, but you shut off market access because you're not able to sell anything that you produce in the UK because they won't accept it, is that enough to compensate for it? And I think the jury's still out on that to some extent. So
can you not do both? Why can't you do both? Obviously, what we export to the EU market will have to be EU compliant, as it is at the moment. If you want to sell something in America, it's got to pass muster on federal regulations.
Well, I think it depends on whether you believe that it's a good thing to have to create separate production lines just for the sake of dealing with separate regulatory regimes. I don't necessarily think it's a great thing, but it may be the way of the future. So in terms of the optimism scale, I'm still probably at about a 7. I just feel that, honestly, once the vaccination program gets going, that I think people will start to worry a little bit less about sort of the minutiae of all this detail and feel a little bit more optimistic in themselves. At the end of the day, business in the UK is just waiting for the government to get off its backs to a certain extent. And so I think once there's any movement of that, people will feel generally more optimistic in the main.
Solid 7 from Ali. Christian, how optimistic are you feeling about how free, prosperous the UK will be in 2 to 3 years' time?
Well, I'm already more optimistic, or rather, I suppose the word is content, since we've left, particularly over the 2 issues of vaccine distribution, which has exemplified so many of the issues that Brexiteers were banging on about for so many years, and that of foreign policy realignment, especially some of the excellent work that's been going on between the UK government, Canada and Australia in relation to Hong Kong and China. So in that sense, I'm already pretty optimistic about the direction the UK is heading in. And I think, the 2 or 3 year medium term is the one that's going to either make or break the reputation of the project. I think it will make it. There's already a lot of work going on. There are new borders coming in, new trade deals being struck. So I think we can go for a 7.5 or 8 in that time period.
It's an integer. You've got to pick an integer. I always
8.
tell people 8.
Go on.
8.
Go on.
Okay, 8. My long division is just appalling. I need integers. Chris, let me finish with you. I mentioned in the chat you were getting flamed earlier that Chris Snowdon's now the Witchfinder General. He wants big government. He's a lockdown enthusiast. So I'll just use that. We don't want to get into that argument now. We're way over time already. But there might not, thank God, have been civil war in the United States. But the IEA is going to have its own civilized civil war, I think, on Friday, when you're going to take on Victoria Hewson with different views about what the state should do around lockdown. So you can wait till Friday to hear Chris's justification there. The other question for you, which I think is at least as important, somebody asked in the chat, what has happened to your leather armchair?
I couldn't be bothered to set it up today. I couldn't be bothered to turn the screen around and sit down there. I just thought I'd sit in my. This is my usual workstation. Okay. It'll be back next time. I didn't realise there was going to be such popular demand, and I'm delighted to hear that there was such a stream of comments about my my newfound communism and statism. Well, I look forward to seeing them later. I've had quite a lot of it on Twitter recently. So yeah, 2 p.m. Friday, I'll be talking to Victoria about why I don't think we should allow tens of thousands of people to die in the next couple of months.
And Victoria will be putting the more strictly libertarian position. That will be on the IEA London YouTube channel, this same platform at 2 p.m. on Friday. And Chris, you're usually the miserable old sod in the gathering. What's your optimism rating over the next 2 or 3 years?
About the same as last time, which is a 3. I can't see any reason to be more optimistic. Maybe if I was in the sunshine in Tenerife, I'd be on a 6 or 7. I don't know, but certainly it's very, very grim up here at the moment. So what can you say? I mean, it's great that we got a Brexit deal. That's good, of course. It's great that we got the vaccinations, but we've still got the economic catastrophe and awful effects of this lockdown. I mean, this lockdown is just so much grimmer than the first one, really, and it's only, I don't know, a fifth of the way through, perhaps. I mean, it's just devastating. So why do I support it? Well, because painful trade-offs. I think it would have been even worse the other way around. But it's bad either way. And so how can you give the country more than the 3 when you've got this kind of choice?
I think that's your highest number in months.
No, I've been 3 the last couple of times. I was 0 at one point last year.
But you picked yourself up off the floor.
Shut up.
I think my number's going to be a 7, but as Chris rightly says, that's because it's sunny every day where I'm at, and I need to shortly go and head to my restaurant, which is open, and have a pint of beer in a bar. Do you remember these luxuries? They'll be coming back before too long. I'm a 7, and also because Southampton got through the 3rd round of the FA Cup last night, and we're playing Arsenal twice in the coming days, so that should be 2 easy wins for the Saints as well. So I'm a very optimistic 7, which means that our total number comes to 48. I didn't ask Tom, so I've got to divide that by 8 of us. That's 6, isn't it? 6.0, flat 6.0. Started the year a bit above average, optimistically. 6.0 is our overall rating. Christian, Ali, Chris, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Been wonderful to have your company. Look forward to speaking to you again virtually very soon and hopefully in person before long. Thanks also to our earlier guests, John O'Connell, Terry Kibbe, Calvin Robertson, Matt Kilcoyne and Tom Whipple. Before we go, just a reminder of my one-man fiscal stimulus mission. If you want to earn 50 quid of my hard-earned money, we have a trivia question for you. In terms of US presidential elections, in what way is Virginia ahead of Ohio? And by how much is the tiebreaker? In terms of US presidential elections, in what way is Virginia ahead of Ohio and by how much? If you think you know the answer to that question, ping an email to the address that just appeared on the screen, lwl@iea.org.uk, and I'll announce the winner next week if any of you get it and give you 50 quid of my hard-earned salary. If 50 quid isn't enough for you, Richard Koch is offering one lucky winner £50,000. He's more than 1,000 times richer than I am, but is showing extreme generosity, and that's for the Richard Koch Breakthrough Prize. The first prize will be 50 grand for the winning essay on how to help supercharge and boost left behind areas of Britain through free market policy reform. The deadline is fast approaching, so go to breakthroughprize.org.uk if you'd like to find more information. You only need to write a short essay, and if it's good enough, you'll get on the shortlist, and then you'll have a chance to win 50 grand. So do consider that as well. If you're watching us on YouTube and you've enjoyed the show, please give us the thumbs up. Please subscribe. Please hit the notifications bell, because that will keep you informed of all of our upcoming broadcasts. I've already mentioned Chris and Victoria, the Snowdon versus Houston heavyweight battle coming on Friday afternoon. Next Tuesday evening, Tuesday the 26th at 6 p.m, I'll be interviewing Jacob Rees-Mogg on the IEA London YouTube channel at 6 o'clock. And Live with Littlewood will be back at 6 o'clock next Wednesday, the 27th of January. So we'll see you all then. And so the last thing for me to say is thank you for all of our donors. You make all of our work possible. If you're not yet a donor, you can contribute in any small way, or preferably a big way. Go to our website, find the donate button, and we would greatly appreciate any financial support you can give us so that we can keep the show on the road. Thank you all for watching us. Thanks again for to our guests. We will see you soon. Stay safe, stay free, stay warm. Over and out.